My family betrayed me to shield my brother from his $30,000 debt. This is how I fought back and found freedom. My childhood in suburban Chicago always appeared perfect from the outside. We had a tidy house on a quiet cul-de-sac, 2 working parents, and a younger brother everyone adored. However, behind that flawless surface was a harsh reality that influenced who I am today. From the moment I could comprehend words, I understood my place in the family. I was the reliable one, the one who had to strive, achieve, and set an example for my younger brother Jake. He, on the other hand, was the golden child, incapable of doing wrong. Jake is 7 years younger than me, and that age gap meant I wasn't just a sibling. I was a stand-in third parent. By the time I turned 12, I was babysitting him every day, even during school breaks, while my mom and dad worked. I didn't mind at first. He was an adorable little kid who followed me everywhere. But as we grew older, the difference in how we were treated became impossible to overlook. When I was 17 and Jake was 10, the contrast was striking. I remember one evening sitting at the dining table with my chemistry textbook open, struggling to solve a difficult equation. I had received a B- on a test, the first time I hadn't gotten an A. My parents' reaction? They grounded me for a whole month for just one B-. That same week, Jake had been caught stealing $20 from my dad's wallet for the second time. My dad scolded him lightly, saying, "Jake, you know better than that." But there was no grounding, no punishment, just a warning. When I asked why Jake wasn't punished as I had been, my mom responded, "He's younger, Melissa. You should know better. Besides, Jake's sensitive. We don't want to push him too hard." It wasn't only discipline where the favoritism appeared. My parents dedicated all their emotional energy to ensuring Jake's happiness, assuming I could handle myself. When I brought home straight A's, the only response I received was, "Good, but you could still do better in calculus." When I graduated as valedictorian, my mom's first reaction wasn't pride, but worry. "I hope this doesn't make Jake feel bad about his grades." It was as though I had done something wrong by excelling. Meanwhile, Jake coasted through life. He barely passed his classes, spending most of his time in the basement playing video games. If his grades were bad, it was okay. He needed a break from the pressure. By the time he was 16, he had dropped out of most extracurriculars, claiming he didn't have the energy for them. My parents didn't push him. Instead, they pampered him, often repeating, "Not everyone is like you, Melissa." This double standard only worsened as we entered adulthood. When I turned 18, I was eager to leave home. I had worked at a diner for 2 years, saving every penny, and had enough for a bus ticket to New York and the first few months of rent for a small apartment I would share with a college roommate. When I told my dad I was leaving, he shrugged and said, "Good. You'd have to start paying rent if you stayed anyway." It hurt, but I moved on. I put myself through college, working 2 jobs while managing classes, eating ramen more nights than I could count. Meanwhile, Jake stayed home. He started at a community college but dropped out after 1 semester, claiming it was too stressful. My parents' response? They gave him an allowance to figure things out. He spent the next 5 years living at home, occasionally taking a part-time job that he would quit after a month or 2, always blaming the manager or the work environment for being toxic. When I graduated with honors and landed my first entry-level software engineering job, I thought I had finally proven myself. But even then, my parents couldn't summon much enthusiasm. My dad's only remark was, "Must be nice to finally have some job security." My mom asked if I would help Jake pay his rent since he was still finding himself. It was as though nothing I did mattered unless it benefited Jake. Throughout it all, I tried to stay the course. I built my career from the ground up, moving from entry-level to mid-management at a major tech company. I saved for a house, bought a car, and invested in my future. Every achievement was the result of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. Yet no matter how much I achieved, my family acted as though it was only possible because of their sacrifices, as if they deserved credit for my independence while they continued enabling Jake's irresponsibility. The resentment grew slowly, like water accumulating behind a dam. Each unfair comment, every instance of favoritism, each dismissal of my efforts, added to the weight over time. I started to spend less time with my family. Calls became infrequent, and when I did visit, it felt more like an obligation than a joyful reunion. I wasn't angry, or at least I convinced myself I wasn't. I simply didn't see the reason to engage with people who treated me as a resource rather than a person. Yet, part of me still hoped. Maybe one day my parents would realize how deeply their actions had hurt me. Maybe Jake would mature and start taking responsibility. Maybe, just maybe, we could be a family again. But those hopes grew fainter with each passing year. By the time I turned 36, I had learned better. My role had always been clear. I was the safety net, the problem solver, the one expected to step in whenever Jake's life fell apart. Jake, on the other hand, was the golden boy, always protected from consequences, waiting for someone else to clean up his messes. I had accepted it for years, but I would soon discover even a safety net has its limits. Leaving home was both daunting and liberating. At 19, I moved to New York City with 2 suitcases, a few $100s, and an unwavering resolve to succeed. I shared a cramped apartment with a college roommate I had found online. The place was barely big enough for the 2 of us, and the sound of traffic was constant, seeping through the thin walls. But it was mine, and for the first time, I felt free. Meanwhile, Jake stayed back in Chicago, living rent-free and spending his time playing video games in the basement. I worked double shifts at a diner to afford tuition at a state university. During the day, I balanced classes and late-night study sessions in the library. At night, I waited tables, earning just enough in tips to cover rent and food, mainly consisting of instant noodles. I didn't resent the hard work. In fact, I was proud of it. Every dollar I earned and every grade I fought for was proof that I could make it on my own. Jake, on the other hand, took a different path. He enrolled in a local community college at my parents' urging, but he dropped out within months. He claimed the classes were overwhelming, the professors too strict, and the coursework wasn't for him. My parents' reaction was predictable. They didn't push him to go back or suggest he find a job. Instead, they gave him an allowance and told him to take his time figuring things out. Every time I called home, I heard the same story. Jake was still looking for his passion. Jake was under a lot of stress. Jake wasn't like me. My mom would remind me whenever I asked why they kept enabling him. "You've always been so independent, Melissa. You don't need our help. Jake does," she'd say. By the time I graduated with honors, I had accumulated more student debt than I cared to remember. But I also had a job offer waiting at a small tech firm in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I packed up and moved across the country, determined to build my life on my own terms. Meanwhile, Jake turned 21 and still hadn't held a job for more than a few weeks. My parents continued supporting him financially, even paying for his rent when he eventually moved into his own apartment downtown. They went to lengths that still amazed me, helping him buy a car when he complained about the unreliability of public transportation, paying for his groceries when he said he was too busy to cook, and even covering the costs of his short-lived business venture, which turned out to be a pyramid scheme. When I asked why they didn't let him face the consequences of his actions, my dad's response was as dismissive as ever. "He's young. He'll figure it out. Not everyone can be like you." That phrase haunted me. Not everyone can be like you. It became their excuse for everything. Jake could wander through life without direction because he wasn't like me. He could waste money and quit jobs because he wasn't like me. It wasn't his fault. It was mine. I had set the bar too high, and they didn't want to pressure him to reach it. Over time, their favoritism began to weigh on me more than I cared to admit. Every time they asked me to help with Jake's latest crisis, I swallowed my frustration and stepped in. When he needed money for rent after losing yet another job, I sent him $500. When his girlfriend broke up with him and he asked to stay with me for a few weeks, I said yes, even though I barely had space for myself in my one-bedroom apartment. Each time, my parents assured me it was just temporary. "He just needs a little support, Melissa. You're his sister. Family helps family." That was their line. It didn't matter how many times Jake messed up or how much I sacrificed to clean up his messes. They expected me to step in because that's what family does. And each time I did, I told myself it would be the last time. But the reality was, I was too afraid to refuse. Deep down, I still longed for their approval. I thought that if I continued helping, maybe they would finally notice everything I had done for them. Perhaps they would begin to value me the way they cherished Jake. Maybe they would understand that I wasn't just the reliable one. I was the one keeping everything from falling apart. That hope fueled me, even as my own life became more demanding. By my late 20s, I had advanced in my tech company and was finally earning enough to feel secure. I bought my first car, a second-hand sedan, which felt like a luxury after years of depending on buses and trains. A few years later, I made a down payment on a small house in Seattle. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, a symbol of all my hard work. When I shared the news with my parents, their reaction was almost non-existent. My mom changed the topic to Jake's new girlfriend, a woman he had met online. My dad made a joke about how it was about time I settled down, as though buying a house wasn't an accomplishment worth celebrating. I brushed it off, but the sting lingered. No matter what I did, it was never enough. Meanwhile, Jake was still hopping from one failed job to the next, each time blaming his bosses or co-workers for his inability to succeed. He had started dabbling in risky investments, convinced he could get rich quick through cryptocurrency. Unsurprisingly, he lost everything within weeks. When he called me for help, I gave him the same advice I always did: take responsibility for your actions. He didn't like that answer, and neither did my parents. "Why can't you just help your brother?" my mom asked during one of her rare calls. "You're doing so well, Melissa. It's not like you can't afford it." I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell her that everything I had was the result of my hard work, not theirs, but instead, I stayed silent, as always, letting the guilt take over. However, something inside me was beginning to change. For the first time, I started to question whether the cost of keeping the peace was too great. How much longer could I keep sacrificing my own happiness for a family that never truly appreciated me? How much more could I give before I finally reached my breaking point? It was a cold evening in February when my phone buzzed with a call from my mom. She rarely called me unless there was a crisis, so I immediately braced myself. As expected, the moment I answered, I could hear the strained cheerfulness in her voice, the overly pleasant tone she used when she wanted something. "How's work, Melissa? Still with that soft company?" Her questions were so generic they might as well have been scripted. "Yes, Mom, same job, same company," I replied, already tired of the conversation. "That's wonderful. And how's your boyfriend?" she continued, as if she hadn't forgotten his name the last time we spoke. "I'm single, Mom, you know that. We broke up over a year ago." "Oh, right. I must have mixed that up. And your apartment? Still liking it?" "I don't live in an apartment. I bought a house 2 years ago." There was a brief silence, and for a moment, I thought she might finally realize how little she knew about my life. But instead, she pressed on, her voice adopting a familiar mix of concern and guilt. "Melissa, I hate to ask you this, but it's about Jake. He's in a bit of trouble." Of course it was about Jake. It was always about Jake. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Well, he borrowed some money, about $30,000, and the people he borrowed it from aren't the nicest types. They've started demanding repayment, and he's struggling." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $30,000? Who even lends that much money to someone like Jake? How on earth did he rack up that kind of debt? I asked, half expecting some ridiculous explanation involving another failed business venture or another cryptocurrency scam. "That doesn't matter right now," my mom said dismissively. "What matters is that he's your brother and he needs your help. Family helps family, Melissa. We've always taught you that." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. Family helps family was their mantra every time they needed me to bail Jake out. It was never about helping me, never about supporting my achievements. It was always about cleaning up his mess. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't do it." "I can't assist him this time," I stated, my voice resolute. The silence on the other end of the line was overwhelming. Then, as if a switch had flipped, her tone turned frigid. "You're being selfish," she snapped. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Your father and I gave up so much for you, Melissa, and now, when your brother needs you the most, you're abandoning him. Do you want his blood on your hands if something happens?" Her words felt like daggers, each one more piercing than the last. But this time, I didn't let them wound me deeply. I had spent years being the responsible one, the problem solver, the fixer. And where had it gotten me? A lifetime of unrecognized sacrifices, and a family that saw me only as a safety net for Jake's reckless actions. "No, Mom, I'm not doing it," I declared, hanging up the call. As soon as I disconnected, a wave of emotions hit me. Relief for standing my ground, guilt for refusing my family, and fear about what would happen next. I sat at my desk in my office, staring at the phone, half expecting another call, but none came, not immediately anyway. The fallout began a few days later when my phone buzzed with messages from my mom, all along the same lines. How could I be so heartless? Didn't I care about my brother's well-being? My dad, usually the more reserved of the two, sent an email, his words colder and more deliberate. He accused me of abandoning my family and forgetting my roots. Then came the bank notification. It was a Tuesday morning when I received a call from my bank's fraud department. Someone had tried to access my account using my personal details. They had my social security number, my mother's maiden name, even the name of my childhood pet. The security team flagged the attempt and blocked it before any funds could be moved. I felt nauseous. The only person who could have known that information was Jake. I changed all my passwords, updated my security questions, and added extra safeguards to all my accounts. But the damage had already been done. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about betrayal on a scale I hadn't imagined. A few days later, my aunt, one of the few relatives I still trusted, called. She had heard through the family that Jake was telling everyone I was refusing to help him, painting me as a cold, selfish sister hoarding my wealth while he struggled. That's not all, she added. Jake's been borrowing money from other relatives too. Grandma, Uncle Mike, even your cousin Sarah. Each time, he gives a different reason for why he needs it. I think his debts are much worse than you realize. I thanked her for the information, although it only added to my mounting anxiety. This wasn't just a family issue anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. The final blow came a week later when I decided to confront Jake in person. I showed up unannounced at his rundown apartment, determined to get answers. He appeared disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, and his clothes wrinkled. "Melissa, took you long enough," he said as he opened the door. "Cut the crap, Jake," I demanded. "Did you try to hack into my bank account?" He didn't even attempt to deny it. "Mom and Dad said if things got bad enough, you'd cave." "I was just speeding things up," he explained, as if it were perfectly reasonable. I stood there stunned. This was my brother. The same kid I had looked after, protected, and supported for years. And he didn't even realize what he had done was wrong. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "Relax," he replied. "It's not like I actually took anything. Besides, you've got plenty. What's the big deal?" The big deal was that he had crossed a line I could no longer ignore. And as much as it hurt, I knew this wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about me, my future, and my right to protect what I had worked so hard to build. After leaving Jake's apartment, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with emotions, anger, disappointment, sadness, but above all, I felt betrayed, not only by Jake, but by my parents who had supported him every step of the way. I drove home in silence, the reality of the situation sinking in with each passing mile. Jake wasn't just irresponsible, he was dangerous. He had no hesitation about crossing ethical boundaries, even if it meant stealing from his own sister. And my parents had enabled him. They had the nerve to defend his actions, calling his attempt to break into my bank account a misguided mistake. That evening, I began taking precautions. I contacted my company's IT security team and explained the situation. They guided me through the necessary steps to protect my device and online accounts. I also installed a high-end security system in my home, which included cameras and motion detectors. It might have seemed like paranoia, but after what Jake had done, I wasn't willing to take any risks. The following morning, I got a call from my Aunt Catherine, one of the few family members I still trusted. Her voice was full of worry. "Melissa, we need to talk," she said. "What's going on?" I asked, already fearing the answer. "It's your parents," she replied. "They've been telling everyone that you've abandoned Jake when he needed you. They're painting you as a cold-hearted sister who refuses to help her struggling brother." I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still hurt. "Great. What else is new?" I responded bitterly. "There's more," she said. "Jake's been going to other relatives asking for money. He told Grandma it was for medical bills, Uncle Steve that it was for a business venture, and he told me it was for rent. None of it adds up." The pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, and the picture was darker than I had anticipated. Jake wasn't just careless. He was manipulative, telling different stories to get what he wanted. "Thanks for letting me know, Catherine. I'll deal with this," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. Later that week, I received an email from my dad, the first direct contact since I had declined to help Jake. It was brief, cold, and blunt. "Your actions have left us no choice but to reconsider your place in this family. We have always supported you, provided for you, and given you every chance to succeed. If you continue to abandon your brother, there will be consequences. Think carefully about your next move." I stared at the email, a mix of disbelief and fury rising inside me. The nerve they had to claim they had supported me when they hadn't contributed a cent to my education or living expenses. The idea that my success was somehow due to their sacrifices was absurd. But the warning at the end of the email sent a shiver down my spine. Consequences? What could that even mean? I forwarded the email to my lawyer and asked for advice. She suggested I document everything, texts, emails, and voicemails, as a precaution. I also decided to send an email to my extended family to clarify the situation. In it, I explained what had been happening: Jake's growing debts, his attempt to hack into my bank account, and my parents' refusal to hold him responsible. I included screenshots of threatening messages and a transcript of my last conversation with Jake. I wasn't trying to stir up trouble. I just couldn't bear the thought of my name being dragged through the mud while the truth stayed hidden. The fallout was swift. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years contacted me, sharing their own experiences with Jake. My cousin Rachel said he had borrowed $2,000 from her to cover car repairs and never paid her back. Uncle Mike revealed that Jake had used his identity to open a credit card. Even Grandma, the kindest person I knew, admitted that Jake had stolen $500 from her purse during a visit, claiming he had borrowed it. It was worse than I had imagined. The tipping point came when Jake's current roommate reached out to me after reading my email. He told me that Jake had been acting strangely, making cryptic remarks about teaching people lessons and getting what he wanted. The roommate had also found suspicious credit card statements in Jake's room, accounts that weren't in Jake's name. I forwarded all this information to my lawyer and discussed filing a restraining order. At this stage, it wasn't just about money. It was about safety. But the most shocking revelation came a few days later when Aunt Catherine called again. "Melissa, you're not going to believe this," she said. "Jake's ex-roommate reached out to me. He says Jake stole his identity and opened several lines of credit in his name. He's been too embarrassed to come forward, but after seeing your email, he's willing to talk." The weight of it all hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. Jake's actions were criminal, and my parents had been complicit in hiding them. That weekend, I met with my lawyer to discuss the next steps. She advised me to go to the police with the evidence I had gathered. It wasn't an easy choice. I knew it would tear my family apart, but I also knew I couldn't stay silent. As I sat in the police station filing a report against my own brother, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time, I was standing up for myself, refusing to let Jake's bad choices and my parents' toxic enabling drag me down. By the end of the week, the family group chat was filled with messages from relatives who had finally discovered Jake's true nature. For years, I had been labeled as the distant, ungrateful daughter who refused to help my struggling brother. But now the truth was exposed, and everyone was furious. At Jake, at my parents, and at themselves for falling for his lies. Uncle Mike shared how Jake had maxed out a credit card he co-signed, leaving him with thousands in debt. Cousin Rachel confessed that she had been too embarrassed to speak out when Jake didn't repay a loan. Even Aunt Catherine, my loyal ally, admitted that Jake had asked her for money, claiming it was to cover medical bills. Each new story added to the growing pile of evidence against him. However, the most damaging revelation came from Jake's current roommate, who reached out to me after hearing about my email. Initially unaware of Jake's financial schemes when they moved in together, the roommate grew suspicious after finding credit card statements and documents with unfamiliar names. Realizing something was wrong, he became enraged and evicted Jake within a week. Meanwhile, my parents refused to believe Jake could be so deceitful and insisted everyone was overreacting. My mom, ever the master of guilt, called me in a final attempt to salvage her version of events. "Melissa, this has gone too far," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're tearing this family apart. Do you really want that on your conscience?" "No, Mom," I replied, calm but firm. "I'm not tearing the family apart. I'm just refusing to keep enabling Jake. That's on you." I hung up before she could respond. The fallout was hard on my parents. For years, they had carefully crafted an image of the perfect supportive family. My dad was seen as the strong, silent provider, and my mom as the doting, faultless mother. But now, their friends and community members saw through the facade. Their social circle began shrinking. My mom's church friends stopped inviting her to gatherings, and my dad's golfing buddies suddenly found themselves too busy for their weekly games. Even my parents' closest friends started to distance themselves, unwilling to align with their defense of Jake's behavior. As for Jake, the consequences of his actions eventually caught up with him. The police took my report seriously, especially after hearing from his former roommate and reviewing the evidence I provided. While the investigation was ongoing, Jake found himself unable to escape the damage. His credit was ruined, his reputation shattered, and he had to take on multiple low-paying jobs just to get by. For the first time, Jake was forced to face the results of his choices. Meanwhile, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. With my parents and Jake out of my life, I could finally focus on myself, my career, my friendships, and my well-being. My job was thriving, and I had recently applied for a promotion. Without the constant stress of family drama hanging over me, I was able to give it my all. When I received the call from my boss saying I'd been chosen for the role, I nearly cried. It was a validation of everything I had worked so hard for. In my personal life, things were also improving. I started dating someone who respected my boundaries and valued my independence. It felt refreshing to be with someone who didn't try to manipulate me or guilt me into doing things I didn't want to do. As for my extended family, many reached out to apologize for believing my parents' version of events for so long. While I appreciated their support, I made it clear that I wasn't interested in rebuilding relationships with anyone who had contributed to the toxic dynamics of the past. I also took extra measures to protect myself. I worked with my lawyer to set up stronger security measures both online and offline. I installed security cameras at my home, updated all my passwords, and set up a monitoring system for any suspicious activity on my financial accounts. The most surprising change, however, came from within. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations, guilt, and manipulation. Saying no to them, exposing the truth, and standing my ground had been some of the hardest things I'd ever done, but they also brought a sense of liberation. I realized I didn't need their approval to be happy. I didn't have to prove myself to people who couldn't see my worth. I had built a life I was proud of, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Not Jake, not my parents, and not anyone else. In the weeks that followed, my parents stopped trying to reach me. No more guilt-tripping calls or emails, no more manipulative texts. It was as if they finally understood I was done playing their game. Jake, too, stayed out of my life. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling to pay off his debts and had burned bridges with nearly everyone in the family. Part of me felt sorry for him, but I knew that helping him again would only enable his behavior. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was the one I needed. Letting go of my family hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. I no longer felt like the scapegoat or the fixer. I was just Melissa, a woman who had worked hard, overcome obstacles, and finally reclaimed her life. As I moved forward, I focused on creating my own version of family, a network of people who valued integrity, accountability, and genuine care for one another. It was a new chapter, and for the first time, it felt like I was writing my own story.